Okay, I think it's time to start. So I'd like to begin by welcoming everyone back here to the second day of this weekend shamatha retreat, focusing on the technique of observing the mind. And let's begin with a meditation that we learnt and practiced in the last session yesterday. So remember, in this weekend's retreat, we're focusing on two variations of observing the mind as the object for shamatha. The first is to simply observe the mind in terms of observing whatever thoughts and so forth are arising in the mind. And the second approach, which we began in session 4 yesterday, was to turn awareness in upon itself and simply knowing we're aware. And that's the practice we'll do now. So remember, in last retreat, we were aware of the sensations of the breath. And in the earlier sessions yesterday, we were aware of the space of the mind and any mental events arising in that space. And so here in this practice of resting in awareness, we're turning awareness in upon itself and simply knowing that we're aware. Of course, in this practice, all sorts of thoughts and so forth will continue to arise, sounds, sensations, emotions, and so forth. But in this practice, we're not paying attention to any appearances. We're not trying to block them. They can be there, let them be there. We're simply not interested in them. The only thing we're interested in is knowing that we're aware. That's all we're doing in this practice, just knowing we're aware. Recommendation, as we saw, as with the earlier practice, to have the eyes open, either naturally or slightly, resting your gaze in the space in front of you. And when we find those two imbalances, if we find ourselves coming up with a lot of agitation, tension, or even distraction, then it's helpful to lower the gaze slightly, tend to release awareness into space, release all appearances, and just relaxing completely. Whereas if we notice we're falling into dullness, drowsiness, or just having a simply blank mind, then it's helpful to elevate the gaze slightly and sharpen the focus, knowing that we're aware. So that's the practice we're going to do, the same as we did in the last session yesterday afternoon. So if you'd like to find a nice, comfortable posture, let's begin. Allowing your awareness to descend into the body and simply becoming aware of sensations throughout the body. And if you notice any areas of tightness or tension in any part of the body, then use the out breath to relax and release that tightness or tension. And relaxing more deeply with each out breath. Softening and relaxing all the muscles in the face. Mouth and jaw, soft and relaxed. And all the muscles around the eyes, soft and relaxed. And if you find it helpful to relax, you can take 3 slow, deep breaths, maintaining awareness of sensations throughout the body as you breathe. And then allowing the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. Not trying to control or regulate the breath in any way. Simply get out of the way and let the body breathe itself, naturally and effortlessly. And with each out-breath, letting go of any thoughts that may have arisen, happily releasing them. And simply allowing the mind to come to rest. Not doing anything at all. Simply being present. Knowing that you're aware. All sorts of appearances will continue to arise. Thoughts, emotions, sounds, sensations, and so on. But now pay no attention to any appearance. Let them be there. They can be there. We're simply not interested in them. The only thing we're interested in is knowing that we're aware. So simply resting in that experience of awareness itself. And if you're finding that you're getting caught up in any agitation, tension, or distraction, lower the gaze, release your awareness into space, releasing all appearances and relaxing completely. And if you're finding that you're simply sinking into dullness or drowsiness, then elevate the gaze and sharpen your focus, knowing that you're aware. And simply rest in that open, spacious stillness of awareness. And we can bring the meditation to a close. Let's have a look at what we'll be covering in this session. We'll begin with a review of some of the main points from yesterday. Then we'll look at what sorts of meditative experiences can arise in these sorts of practices and how do we deal with them. Some tips for the practice that we're doing now, the resting and awareness practice. We'll look at the resting and awareness practice again, add a little bit more to it. We'll do that practice again. And then after, time for question answer. And if we have any time left over at the end of the session, we'll begin our discussion on the stages of progress, this classic presentation, this 9-stage model, the one you have that color diagram and the chart. So let's begin. What is shamatha? So we saw yesterday there that shamatha is a Sanskrit term that we can divide into 2 parts. Shama meaning calm, a mind that is calm, and ta means to abide. So a mind that's not only calm, but it's abiding single-pointedly on an object. So shamatha is really the practice of cultivating a calm, clear, focused mind. In other words, it's a concentration practice, or in Sanskrit, samadhi practice. In the Theravada Buddhist traditions, you often won't see this word shamatha. Rather, when they talk about doing concentration practice, they often say they're doing jhana practice. Jhana is just another level of concentration, but it's the same practice. And we'll look at the relationship between shamatha and jhana in a later session today. Why is shamatha practice important? We saw there that in terms of everyday life, then shamatha practice is helping us to improve our attention skills. If we improve our attention skills, then we're more effective in everything we do. We'll have much better mental balance. We'll really become the masters of our mind. And often it translates into some health benefits, sleep benefits as well. But here at a deeper level, shamatha practice is very important in terms of the pursuit of genuine happiness. There we saw that in all Buddhist traditions, whether we're talking Theravada or Mahayana, they talk about the same 3 core areas of practice of ethics, concentration, and wisdom. So on the basis of ethical lifestyle, avoiding harmful behavior, we engage in the shamatha or concentration practice, developing single-pointed concentration. On that basis, then we enter into the wisdom practice, or often referred to as vipassana, or in Pali, vipassana practice, to gain a direct insight into the nature of reality, and thereby overcome all mental afflictions and suffering and achieve genuine happiness. But if we want to be able to have a direct insight into reality, we need a very stable and clear mind. We need the mind of shamatha. And so hence a quote here from Attention Revolution, where Alan Wallace says, mental balance is the gateway to finding genuine happiness, and shamatha is the key that opens that gate. So shamatha is very crucial in terms of the pursuit of genuine happiness. Without shamatha practice, there is no way that we're going to achieve genuine happiness in a well-being in any sustainable way. And in the shamatha training, we went through a number of different points. One there was in terms of the prerequisites for shamatha practice. We briefly looked at those in the first session, and we'll go back to them and look at them in a little bit more detail in the last session today, in the context of integrating this practice into daily life. Right? These prerequisites are how to really set up our life in such a way to support this practice. And in terms of actual practice, we looked at how to prepare our body, speech, and mind well at the beginning of each meditation session, so as to put our body and mind in an optimal state for shamatha practice. And then within shamatha practice, we saw there that we are really cultivating 3 qualities, the qualities of relaxation, stability, clarity. Foundation is relaxation. Without relaxation, there's no way we're going to be able to cultivate any sort of sustainable stability and clarity. Objects, what object to use in shamatha practice. Alan Wallace is recommending 3 particular objects that are particularly useful for us in the modern world, and we'll look at those again shortly: the breath, mind, and awareness. The two tools we use in this practice: the rope of mindfulness. So to remember, mindfulness was our ability to hold the object, to remember the object, to not forget it, to not become distracted. And introspection was quality control, to monitor the mindfulness, to notice if we're becoming dull or distracted. And then we saw these 5 faults and 8 antidotes. First fault, of course, was laziness, that we need to initially overcome laziness when it comes to doing this practice. And we do that by really reflecting on the benefits of this practice, to have faith in the practice, and thereby aspire to do the practice, put effort into the practice. And then the more effort we put into the practice, the more we'll have this pliancy, this flexibility and serviceability of body and mind, which we'll look at later in a later session today. And if we apply those 8 antidotes to those 5 faults we discussed yesterday, we will then slowly move along these 9 stages to shamatha. And that progression, those 9 stages, we'll look at in some more detail in the next 2 sessions. And then the integrating into daily life we'll also look at in the last session today. So again, here we saw that Alan Wallace is recommending these 3 objects. The general recommendation for shamatha training is use the object that works best for you. And for many of us in the modern world, I think the best object is going to be the breath. And we'll see the reasons for that in a moment in the next slide. And so that's why we focused on mindfulness of breathing in the retreat, the weekend retreat we did 3 weeks ago. The other 2 objects, the ones we're using here in this retreat, observing the mind, in other words, observing thoughts, and the practice we're doing at the moment, the resting in awareness practice. Many of you probably will find those more challenging than focusing on the breath, but as we've seen, both of them potentially give us enormous benefits for us in the modern world. And then in the next 2 sessions, what we're going to do is we're going to combine those 2 practices of observing thoughts and resting in awareness into a practice called stillness in motion. So that's going to be the focus or our practice for the next 2 sessions, but we'll continue on with the resting in awareness practice in this session. A little bit more to explain and meditate on there. And the general recommendation is that and this is coming from many past masters, that if thoughts really dominate our mind, then really the breath is probably going to be the best object for us. And so that accounts for most of us in the modern world. And in the last retreat, we focused on a number of variations of that breath practice: the full body practice, good for relaxation, focus on the abdomen, very good for improving stability of attention, and then focusing at entrance of the nostrils, very good for improving clarity of attention. So the advantages, of course, with the mindfulness of breathing is it helps to get us out of our obsessive, compulsive, discursive mind and help us to get out of the past and the future into the present moment. And the breath is something that is readily available, and compared to other objects, it's relatively easy to focus on. And here yesterday, we looked at this practice of observing the mind, or in other words, observing thoughts. Thoughts here was a generic term. It didn't just mean thinking. It also includes emotions, memories, mental images. So thoughts here, the word thoughts really just means conceptual activity. So the object in that practice that we did in the session 2 and 3 was the space of the mind and whatever mental events arise in that space. And we saw there that the mental events really come in sort of 2 flavors: the more objective type mental events, like discrete things like thoughts, images, memories, and so forth. And then the more subjective type mental events, things like emotions and desires and mental afflictions and so forth. And we often sort of find it more difficult to notice the subjective mental events. So yesterday we put a little bit of emphasis on noticing any subjective mental events like reactions and to pleasant and unpleasant things. Many people find it very challenging to observe thoughts because our strong habit is, when a thought comes up, we grab hold of it and we follow it. So we introduced a couple of short-term strategies there to help us to get into the practice. One is to label or note the thoughts to give us a little bit of space from them, and also then to anchor ourselves in the breath. That can help also avoid getting caught up in thoughts and so forth. Both of these are not really part of the standard practice, but they are things that we can use in the short term to help us to get into the practice if we're just getting swept up in our thoughts all the time. Now, the particular advantages we saw yesterday of observing thoughts was that by developing the ability to observe our thoughts and emotions and memories, we really will be able to become the masters of our mind and not be the slaves of our mind as many of us are now, that we often get caught up in and overwhelmed and tormented by our thoughts, emotions, and memories. By doing this practice, we'll be able to step back, we'll be able to observe them, and we'll really become the masters of our mind. Also very much a healing practice, because a lot of our mental, psychological illness and also physical illness in the modern world is through suppressed mental events, suppressed emotions, suppressed memories, and so forth. And through this practice, we can allow them to come up and to acknowledge them and then process them and release them. And so it's very much a healing practice as well. Also, it's a very much a bridge into Vipassana practice. By observing the mind and our thoughts and so forth, we can really start to intuitively come to an insight into the very nature of our own mind. So we saw there that thoughts, and thoughts, of course, also means emotions and memories and so forth, from their own side, have no power to harm us whatsoever. We had this quote here from Dujung Limpa, the 19th century Dzogchen master. He said, by just letting thoughts be without having to do anything with them, all appearances lose their capacity to harm. Now, if we have some unpleasant thoughts, emotions, or memories come up and we don't know how to deal with them, what we do is we fight with them. We try and suppress them. If we fight with them, we're going to lose. It's like throwing petrol on the fire. They'll just overwhelm us more. So we don't need to get caught up and overwhelmed. We don't need to fight and try and suppress. We simply, like Dujum Lingpa recommends, don't, without having anything to do with them, meaning just step back and watch them. If we watch them, they can't do anything to us, because from their own side, they have no power to do anything. Because if we look at them from their own side, they're virtually nothing. And so that's what it means here by releasing thoughts. Releasing thoughts doesn't mean to let go of them or get rid of them. It means to release identifying with or grasping to thoughts, because it's our identifying and grasping to thoughts that gives the power to thoughts, and then they can really harm us. And so we go through stages of release in this practice. Now we don't release thoughts at all. A thought comes, we grab it, we identify with it, we follow it, or we fight with it and try and suppress it. But if we simply do this practice and we start to observe thoughts, then we can start to release, which is called naked release here, that we simply recognize thoughts as thoughts, and then they're released, meaning they can't do anything to harm us. And if the more familiar we get with that, then we'll get to the next stage, where as soon as a thought appears, we can release it. So they release themselves on appearance. And then if we get even more familiar with the ability to watch thoughts and emotions and memories, they will do what's called self-release. Is that because now we always see thoughts as thoughts, emotions as emotions, memories as memories, we're never identifying and grasping to them, then there's no way they can harm us whatsoever. And so we really will become the masters of our own mind through this practice. And then in the last session yesterday, we moved to the second of the two main practices this weekend retreat, and that is turning awareness in upon itself and just knowing that we're aware. This is sometimes called shamatha, with no object other than awareness itself. And it's simply knowing that we're aware, not paying attention to any sort of appearances that arise, not trying to block them, let them be there, just knowing that we're aware. Now, the big advantages with that, of this practice of resting in awareness for us in the modern world, is once we start to rest in awareness, what we notice is that awareness is completely still and it's completely open and spacious. So therefore, we can rest in that open, spacious stillness. And that can help us not to contract around appearances. And we saw that in the water in the cup analogy yesterday. Now our mind is tight and constricted, like the small amount of water in the cup. And when some small stimulus comes, we tend to react. Whereas if we do this practice, instead of having a tight, constricted mind as our default mode, we can have the open, spacious stillness as our default mode. Then if some small stimulus comes, it's like the pebble dropping into a big, still lake, hardly a ripple. Therefore, with that state of mind of open, spacious stillness, when stimulus comes our way, whether it be pleasant or unpleasant, we won't react with attachment or aversion. We'll simply be present and respond appropriately if need be. This practice, probably even more so than observing thoughts, is very much known as a bridge into the Vipassana practice. And we'll get a little taste of that in a later session today. We'll move a little bit into Vipassana mode later today in this practice. Now, in terms of meditative experiences, all sorts of things can come up in this shamatha practice. Particularly initially, you can have all sorts of physical sensations arising in the body, particularly relating to the breath practice. As we are observing the breath and the breathing starts to settle down, what's really happening is a lot of the subtle energies in the body, which now are completely unbalanced, start to balance. And in that balancing, that causes all sorts of sensations to arise in the body. Some of them are very pleasant. We can have a blissful flow of sensations in the body. Some are very sharp. Some are very strange, floating body, big body, heavy body. Heat in the chest is very common, tingling, vibration, sometimes quite unpleasant sensations. The general recommendation here is don't make a big deal of them. We generally make a big deal of them. If they're pleasant, we go, oh, that's nice. I like that. I want that. Or if they're strange or unpleasant, we go, oh, what's that? I don't like that. Go away. And we get caught up in these experiences. And then our whole practice comes to a grinding halt. And we see this here. Alan Wallace talks about this in his Attention Revolution. So I'd like to just briefly read that on page 47. He says, various physical sensations may occur in meditation. Sometimes you may feel that your limbs are extremely heavy or thick. Sometimes your body may feel very large, or you may feel that you are floating or levitating. Other sensations such as tingling, vibration, or heat are common. You may experience telescopic vision, viewing your body as if from a distance. Especially when you meditate many hours a day, you may experience within your body prana or vital energies shifting and releasing pockets of tension. When you engage in mindfulness of breathing, these energies begin to balance and flow naturally. This is a process that takes time, and while the energies redistribute themselves, their movement produces various sensations. Don't be worried about them or make a big deal of them. These are natural consequences of the practice. And then we also saw a little bit yesterday relating to the observing thoughts practice. Once we really start to get into this practice, we really start to dredge the depths of our psyche, because by observing thoughts, we're no longer consciously or even subconsciously suppressing. And the more that we just watch thoughts, then the more that these things that we're even unconsciously suppressing start to come up. And so we're really dredging the depths of our psyche. And a lot of things can come up, some very unpleasant things. But as we saw here, as we get into this practice of observing thoughts, and we begin to be able to really watch thoughts without getting caught up in them, then they have no power to harm us. So then when these things come up that we've been suppressing, we can simply watch them, acknowledge them, release them, and it can really start the healing process of the mind. So Alan Wallace talks about this on page 101, and we already looked at that yesterday, so we won't go through that again today. But then another thing that is quite common in shamatha practice, particularly the shamatha practice, in all shamatha practice, but particularly in the practice we're doing at the moment, the resting in awareness, is fear. Fear is quite common. And one of the main reasons fear arises is that normally our sense of identity, of who we think we are, is constantly being reinforced by two things. One, solid sense of body. This is me, 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 me. And the other thing that's constantly reinforcing our sense of me or of identity is mental activities. Our thoughts, emotions, memories, and all of those things are constantly reinforcing a sense of me. Now, when we sit down in meditation and we set up a good posture, we relax the body, and then we're focusing on the object of meditation, we can get to a point where there's no longer a sense of body. So a sense of body completely drops away. And then in this shamatha practice, when our mind goes quiet and there's no longer any mental activity, then there's nothing reinforcing a sense of me. And so suddenly we have a lot of fear arising because it seems like either I'm going out of existence or I don't exist at all. And so we get caught up in fear. But this fear is completely irrational, because there's nothing to fear within the stillness of awareness. The only thing going out of existence is a false sense of me, a false sense of me that is the root cause of all of our mental afflictions and suffering. And so if you're having this fear, you can do two things. One is you can ask the question, who's having the fear? Because if you don't exist, there can be no fear. So since fear is arising, you definitely exist. And secondly, then we can understand that this is a false sense of fear, that the only thing going out of existence is a false sense of me that is identifying with body and mind. And on this topic, we're going to be talking much more in the context of the later retreats in Vipassana retreats. Also, depression can arise. So let's have a look at what Alan Wallace talks about these 2 points on page 100. So I think I've covered most of what he says about fear. Just the last part of fear, he says, there is no danger in the empty, luminous space of awareness. You have nothing to lose but your false sense of an independent, controlling ego. The only thing being threatened is an illusion. If you don't identify with it, there's nothing to fear. If you do identify with this fear, it may bring your entire practice to a grinding halt and throw you into deep emotional imbalances. So it is of utmost importance to observe such fear without distraction and without grasping. Keep to the essentials of the practice. And then he talks about depression. He says, another emotional imbalance that may crop up at any time throughout this training is depression, which may be related to a deep-rooted sense of guilt and low self-esteem. When any of these emotions or attitudes arise during meditation sessions, treat them like any other mental events. Watch their emergence, see how they linger, and then observe them disappear back into the space of the mind. Examine them with discerning intelligence, but without any emotional charge. Rather than identifying with them or owning them, let them emerge from the space of awareness and dissolve back without any intervention on your part, even without any preference for them to go away. Let the space of your mind be emotionally neutral, like physical space, which could not care less whether bullets or hummingbirds streak through it. And then also yesterday we saw that also what can arise in shamatha training, in any of these shamatha methods, particularly as we go deeper into the shamatha practices, we're going to start to experience a little bit of bliss in the body and mind. We're going to have more clarity of mind and stillness in terms of non-conceptuality. And again, to avoid getting caught up in these experiences with craving and attachment, because they're all very nice experiences. Rather, use this as signposts that the practice is going in the right direction. So the summary is, with all of these meditative experiences, whether they're physical, whether they're emotional, whether they're positive or negative, pleasant, unpleasant, same advice. Don't make a big deal out of them. Don't get caught up in them with craving and attachment or aversion or fear or anxiety. Just let them be. Observe them arise and pass. And so the recommendation is simply observe them without hope and fear. So for pleasant experiences, that means without the hope that they'll stay there or the fear that they will go away. And for unpleasant experiences, that means without the hope that they will go away or the fear that they will stay. So just observe them. And if we can observe them, we're free of them. They can't create any harm to us whatsoever. Keep to the practice. Because all sorts of physical and mental meditative experiences, they'll come and they'll go, they'll come and they'll go. Stay to the practice, whatever that practice is. Whatever your object is, stick with the object. Some tips for the practice before we go back to the meditation. And here we have 6 words of advice from a great 10th, 11th century Indian Buddhist master in the Mahamudra tradition, Tilopa. And he had a very quintessential pith instructions here. He says, don't recall, don't imagine, don't think, don't examine, don't control, rest. So don't recall means let go of what is past. So don't go off into the past. Don't imagine, then let go of what may come. So don't jump into the future. Don't think means let go of what is happening now. Don't examine, don't try to figure out anything. Don't control, don't try to make anything happen. Simply rest means relax right now and rest. So therefore, stop doing, stop trying to make something happen. Just rest and be and know that we're aware. And the key for this is relaxation. The harder we try, the more difficult to practice. The harder we try, the more we'll try and make something happen. We'll go into doing mode. So let's go back now to the actual practice of resting in awareness. So similar to what we did in the last session at the beginning of this, the last meditation at the beginning of this session, just add one more extra thing to it. That is, if in this resting in awareness practice, you find that you become completely lost in the practice. Either you're completely caught up in thoughts and emotions and all sorts of appearances, or you're completely lost in terms of having a completely blank mind and you don't know what's going on, then anchor yourself in the breath. So go back in the body and notice the rhythm of the breath in the background. So still mainly resting in awareness, but anchoring yourself a little bit in the rhythm of the breath. So just noticing a little bit in the background, the rhythm of the breath. And so that will help to anchor us to avoid either getting completely spaced out or completely caught up in all sorts of distractions. So you might like to experiment with that in this meditation if you find yourself getting completely lost in this practice. So let's do that practice again now. So if you'd like to find a nice, comfortable posture, let's begin. Setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. and relaxing more deeply with each out breath. And with each out breath, letting go of any thoughts that may have arisen, simply releasing them into space. And allowing the mind to come to rest. Not doing anything at all. Simply being present. Knowing that you're aware. Simply resting in that open, spacious stillness of awareness. And if you notice any agitation, tension, or distraction, lower the gaze, release awareness into space, releasing all appearances and relaxing completely. Resting in stillness. And if you find yourself completely lost in this practice, either completely distracted or having a blank mind, then anchor yourself in the breath. So simply rest in stillness and notice the rhythm of your breath a little bit in the background. And so we can bring the meditation to a close. We have time now for some question answers. So either you can type your questions into the chat and Martina will read them out, or if you prefer, you can switch on your webcam and your mic and ask the question that way. So any questions?
Hey, hi, Glenn. This is Atul.
Atul, how are you doing?
Yeah, good, Glenn. Thanks for a good session this morning. So I had a question on this whole, what happens to me when I'm just watching awareness and resting in awareness. So even if I elevate my gaze and I'm just looking straight ahead, I start to feel sleepy because there's really nothing going on, even if I focus on my breathing, and even if I'm alert, let's say I've had a good night's sleep. So how does one sustain the interest in this practice? Because it's easy to just get off into a drowse, and then I'm drowsy for minutes, I'm kind of sleepy, and then I wake up. So what's the solution to that?
Yeah, we're going to talk about this a little bit more detail in the last session today, but I already mentioned briefly yesterday in terms of laziness, how to overcome laziness and develop faith. And to really not only reflect on the benefits of the practice, but also to really, at a more sort of foundation level, is to really reflect on the precious human life that we have, a life full of opportunity, and that it's not going to last forever. And we want to make the life as meaningful as possible. So they are really the foundation reflections in most Buddhist traditions. And to reflect on those, not just intellectually know that. I mean, intellectually, we probably appreciate that, I got a life with opportunity, I'm not going to live forever. Intellectually, we know that, but it doesn't touch us because our behavior is not driven by our intellectual understanding, it's driven by our instinctive habits. An instinctive habit is sort of telling us that actually life sucks, it's not very good. And actually I'm going to live quite a long time, I think. And so therefore we tend to waste our life a lot. And therefore also what we tend to do, because then we look outwards for source of happiness in terms of pleasure, and therefore we get caught up in that. And so when we don't have meaning in our life, we look for pleasure. And to have meaning, we need to really not only reflect on precious human life and death and experientially appreciate that, but we also need to reflect on where is the source of happiness, where is the source of suffering? That is it out there, or is it within my own mind? This is, from a Buddhist perspective, is really reflecting on the first two noble truths, the truth of suffering and the causes of suffering, to really experientially appreciate that the source of my mental afflictions and suffering and the source of happiness lies within my own mind. And the key that opens the door to that is this shamatha practice. And so by engaging in the shamatha practice, then we are opening the door for us to help us to move towards overcoming mental affliction, suffering, and finding that genuine happiness. And so therefore, we're going to not get drowsy in this practice. It's a little bit like, at home, if we're at home in the evening and we're watching a program on TV and we find it a little bit boring, I mean, even if we're not that tired, what happens? We sort of go, we get drowsy. Whereas even if we're a little bit tired and the program is super interesting, it's something that really interests us immensely, what happens? We're completely there. We're completely focused, even if we're a little bit tired. So that's the key to overcoming laziness, as we saw in the faults and antidotes. The faith is not just, if we leave it as intellectual, it won't change anything. I mean, intellectually, we probably know these things. That's why we need to reflect and meditate on these things like precious human life and death, and where is the source of happiness and suffering, to experientially know that. Then that will make a big shift. And then I think you'll find you'll be quite alert in this practice.
Sure.
Okay.
Thanks.
But
Thanks, Glenn. Yeah.
we'll talk a little bit more about this. This is one of the main topics in the last session today. We'll be touching on these points again.
Sure. Thanks.
I think there's a chat question there, looks like. Is there, Martina?
Yes, there is a question from Ross.
Mm-hmm.
Is it worth sometimes doing a grounding practice briefly at the end to bring me back into the body?
So I didn't catch that. Something, a grounding practice. I didn't catch what was the rest.
Yeah. Is it worth sometimes doing a grounding practice briefly at the end to bring me back into the body?
I'm not sure I understand what the question is. You mean like if we are observing the mind, for example, then at the end of the practice to go back into the body?
Yeah, Glenn, should I explain it a little bit? Is that helpful?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, sometimes like doing that practice, I get quite heady and quite wide. So like, you know, your attention is wide, isn't it? Your awareness is wide. And
particularly in the resting awareness?
Yeah, in that practice, yeah.
This practice. Oh, okay, sure.
Yeah, so particularly if it's a shorter practice, to then just get up and move off, actually, not unstable's the wrong word, but I'm in the upper part of my body. I'm kind of wide and out. So sometimes I wondered if it would be beneficial just to ground to the lower part of my body, or get into the physicality of my breath, or if that happens during the practice.
Sure. And we're going to also do a practice relating to that in the last session today that you may find helpful. But the reality is, as you said, is that most of us tend to think our awareness is somewhere up here. And so when we're resting in awareness, we're sort of focusing up here, you know, up here, my awareness is up here. And so then we sort of, you know, the body, which mostly is below that, sort of we lose touch with that. And that's why also in this last meditation, I said that if we're a bit lost in this practice, to anchor yourself in the body, to anchor yourself in the rhythm of the breath. So if you do find during this meditation that this is happening, you're getting really spacey and so forth, then during the meditation, go into the body and focus on the rhythm of the breath. I mean, if you're really completely spaced out, just focus on the rhythm of the breath. Have that as your starting point. Then on that basis, then start to notice awareness, and then shift back more to the awareness. So yes, it's very helpful to ground ourselves in the body if in this practice we are really getting very spacey.
And I think it's particularly for me at the end, it's that transition from moving to being kind of in your mind, you know, and you're right, even if it's lower in my body, you know, at the mind, the heart level, still it's that little transition. I think that's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, if you find that you're a little bit spacey at the end, then yeah, spend a little bit of time to ground yourself in the body, maybe a little bit of focusing on the breath for a couple of minutes to ground yourself before you jump off onto other activities. That's good.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question. Maybe any more chat question, or no? Is there any other question anyone wants to ask? Actually, maybe I can introduce the beginning of the topic for the next session, since we've got a few minutes left. In the next session, we're going to go back to looking at the stages of progress. So yesterday we saw that there are a number of different models used to describe the stages of progress in shamatha. The classic model is the one we're going to spend some time on in the next two sessions. This color diagram that you've got in the chart, this 9-stage model. And that's typically the one that's used with the mindfulness of breathing. Whereas in the practice that we did yesterday, the observing thoughts, we have this 4-stage model that we briefly mentioned yesterday, that it's much more common to see this model used to describe the stages of progress when we are using the observing the thoughts practice. In terms of the first stage, a cascade of a waterfall of thoughts crashing down on us. And if we keep watching those thoughts, then the amount of thoughts will slow down a little bit. It'll be more like a fast flowing river of thoughts. If we keep watching and not feeding, and then we'll start to get gaps, more and more gaps between thoughts, slow down even more. And then it'll be more like a slow moving river of thoughts. And eventually, if we keep watching the mind will eventually go completely quiet and still. So that slow moving river of thoughts will empty into the still lake or the ocean. And so this is the 4-stage model. And then we have the quality of experience relating to that. We see here that initially there's a lot of movement. Then once we start to be able to observe the thoughts better, we then have a sense of achievement. And that achievement then, as we get deeper into the practice, it becomes one of familiarity, that it becomes completely familiar to us to simply observe thoughts. And then eventually the mind will go completely still. So we'll have an experience of stillness. And then that stillness will even get to an experience of perfection. And then we have the correlation with the 9-stage model here. And we'll look at that, start to look at that in the next session. So just 1 or 2 more points before we go to have a break and then the next session. So the materials we'll use for the next 2 sessions is this color diagram and the chart. So in the last retreat, 3 weeks ago, we went through the first 4 stages. And in each one of those stages, we use a number of points, and they're all listed here in this chart. So if you have the chart rather, available in the next session, that would be good. The color diagram you'll see on each slide, but if you have a printout of the chart, then you may find that helpful to refer to, because it has an overview of all the points. If not, then they're mentioned on the slides anyway. And so what we saw already earlier is that shamatha is really attained by progressing through these 9 stages here, relying on the 8 antidotes to abandon the 5 faults. And it's also said that this is accomplished through the 6 powers and the 4 mental engagements. So here we have the 9 stages to shamatha listed, from directed attention up to attentional balance. The 6 powers are what is the power that enables us to go to the next level of the practice. So initially, the power that enables us to get into the practice is the power of hearing, and then thinking, mindfulness, and so forth. And so they are symbolized by the bends in the road here that enable us to go to the next level of the shamatha practice. And we'll look at those 6 powers in the context of those 9 stages starting in the next session. And the 4 mental engagements is, how are we engaging on the object? And that initially, what's called focused engagement is we need to put a lot of effort simply to focus on the object, because most of the time we're completely distracted. But then when we go a bit further in the practice, we are then mainly focused on the object, but every so often we're interrupted by dullness or distraction. So then the next number of stages, we have this interrupted type of mental engagement. And then at the higher levels, when we have eliminated all laxity, excitation, all dullness, distraction, then our engagement on the object is uninterrupted. And then eventually at the 9th level, the highest level, it becomes completely effortless, how we engage on the object, completely spontaneous. And we'll look at those stages of mental engagements also in the next session. So that's all I wanted to cover in this session. So let's take a break now and come back in about 25 minutes at 10:45. We'll then, the first meditation will be another variation of this resting in awareness. And we'll introduce actually a little bit of Vipassana to it. And then we'll go to this practice of stillness in motion, which is really combining the 2 practices of observing thoughts and resting in awareness. And so that's going to be the main topic for the next session. So let's take a break and come back at 10:45. So in about 25 minutes time.